Okay, right. It's the part-time trader. Great to be back with you guys. Appreciate it has been a while since I dropped anything on YouTube, so big apologies for the absence. But if you are keen to get more of my content, then please do head over to X and follow me through at Part-Time Charts, where I'm posting more or less on a daily basis. Less video content, but lots more sort of screenshots of charts that you guys might find interesting. Before I get started today, just a reminder that I am a part-time trader. I'm not a professional. You should not be taking advice from me, but I am someone who has become obsessed with markets and technical analysis, and over the last 10 years have done my best to teach myself how to get ahead, get a bit of an edge in the market. So this is a channel that I use to share some of my thoughts, some of my musings on where assets like cryptocurrencies and equities are heading. If you find any of it entertaining, informative, useful, then please do hit subscribe. Would love to have you on board for my journey, and hopefully I can bring you some useful content in the weeks and months ahead. But remember, it's not financial advice, so please don't make any financial decisions off the back of anything you hear here. Right, let's get started. I wanted to kick off with this Bitcoin chart. Now, if you've not followed me previously, you will look at this and you will think, this guy is absolutely bonkers. Is he really calling for Bitcoin to head down to $3,000 over the next couple of years? And the answer is yes. This is a chart that I've posted numerous times, probably since the end of 2024, when I first started to really flip bearish on Bitcoin. And I could see that this was unfortunately what turned out to be a much longer topping out process than what I had originally envisaged, but a topping out process nonetheless. And Bitcoin is now about 50% off the highs that we put in late 2025, back in September last year. Many people are still extremely bullish on this asset, but I posted an update earlier this week to show how I believe this sort of $74,000 region is key. And as you can see, this is held as resistance a couple of times before being flipped into support last year and then back tested as resistance recently. On the daily chart, there are early signs that maybe the sort of uptrend that has been forming since we hit this bottom in February is starting to wane, starting to lose strength, and potentially we could see price rolling over shortly. I'm less convinced about the significance of this very small uptrend, because I think these patterns can morph and change and shift over time. But for me to even entertain the idea that there would be any upside ahead for Bitcoin, I think we would have to see a flip, a reclaim of this $74,000 region before I could start to look for higher prices. And even if we do start to look for higher prices in the weeks and months ahead, in my view, I think whatever kind of rally we were able to muster would only be short term, would only be a lower high for the market before we roll over and start to head much lower. But for me to sort of, lots of people have asked me, well, why is your price target so low? People seem to find this chart slightly random. Lots of debate about whether this bottom trend line is valid or not. I believe it is. I believe that, in order to be successful in markets, you've got to have a little bit of imagination. You've got to try and predict what the future may look like. And sometimes the most ridiculous looking outcomes are the ones that end up being most likely. And I think that this is a scenario that very few people are prepared for. Almost everyone in the Bitcoin space believes that even if there is more downside, it will be short-lived, and that this asset will continue its long-term trend of going much higher and putting in these really kind of powerful parabolic moves to the upside. For a bit of background on why I don't think that is the case, and for a bit of background on why I think some of these really shockingly low targets are possible, I need to give you guys a slightly broader view on Bitcoin. And I wanted to start with a little bit of a look at the gold versus Bitcoin chart, because gold has clearly been outperforming Bitcoin for some time now. So since the summer last year, you can see that gold has been pressing up and has pretty much just slightly more than doubled in price versus Bitcoin. So if you've been a gold bull, you've really benefited from the sort of parabolic move that we saw in gold late last year heading into early 2026. And if you're holding Bitcoin, you're probably feeling quite depressed about the fact that we're 50% off the all-time high at the moment. But this chart tells a really interesting story. You can check back at what I was posting at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025. This was a squiggle that I drew out at the time, and we are following it pretty accurately at the moment. We're slightly behind schedule, and I do believe that we will hit this target up here, which means there's a lot more upside for gold eventually. But it could be that it takes us longer to get there, and that perhaps it's not 2026, maybe it's 2027 or even 2028 before we get up here. But I'm utterly convinced that the long-term trend of Bitcoin outperforming gold, which started obviously way back at Bitcoin's inception. Look at this, where Bitcoin was worth nothing and has absolutely destroyed the performance of gold over the last 15 years. To me, it looks like that trend is coming to an end. The first sign is that gold has finally broken this downtrend, which we've seen has been suppressing the price of gold relative to Bitcoin all the way back to 2013. So we're talking about a sort of 13-year trend of Bitcoin, failing to break out until a couple of years ago. We finally got the breakout, we got the retest, and to me, all this price action that we're seeing since 2020, 2021 to the current day feels like a big accumulation range where gold is gearing up for a massive trend shift. The first warning sign of that trend shift was obviously the downside break and the retest of this downtrend. And when this accumulation comes to an end, which I think will happen at some point this year or next, I think we're going to see gold appreciate rapidly against not just the US dollar, but massively against Bitcoin too. And so when people ask me, $3,000 just seems like a ridiculous target, Bitcoin would never get there, I would just caution people to think carefully about some of the long-term trend shifts that we are seeing. Bitcoin has been an asset that has outperformed pretty much everything over the last 15 years since its inception. But we are now starting to see that this performance is flattening out. And if you take a look at, there's another really interesting chart that I posted on X earlier this week, this is the NASDAQ versus Bitcoin. And again, really interesting that this big sort of downtrend for the NASDAQ versus Bitcoin has held in place since mid-2017. So the best part of a decade now. We have, every time we've hit this trend line here, all the way through to early 2026, every time we've hit this trend line, we've bounced off it, and Bitcoin has appreciated relative to the NASDAQ. But look at where we are today. We've finally broken this really clean downtrend. The NASDAQ is coiling above the downtrend and looks set for some really significant upside versus Bitcoin. So I guess the key thing for me is, even if you don't believe that Bitcoin is heading to $3,000, even if you think I'm completely bonkers for believing that kind of downside is even possible, you have to start questioning whether the days of Bitcoin being one of the best performing assets in the world, whether the days of Bitcoin crushing the NASDAQ and gold and lots of other assets, whether those days are actually behind us. And I believe that for the short to medium term they are. I do think that one day Bitcoin will come roaring back, and it will eventually go to several $100,000, potentially even seven figures one day. But I don't believe that time is coming in the near future. I believe that there are much better opportunities out there in the market. And to give you a taste of what I mean, just look at this is the 2017 high for Bitcoin in December 2017, right? So this was the peak of the first really high profile bull run that cryptocurrency holders experienced. Lots of people got sucked into the market here before the Bitcoin price collapsed from $20,000 to $3,000. over the next sort of 12 months in 2018. And look at where we are today. So remember, this is not Bitcoin priced in USD. This is the price of the NASDAQ relative to Bitcoin. And where we are is pretty much exactly the same price, exactly the same level as we were at the peak of the 2017 bull run. Now, why is that significant? Well, that means that if you were to have bought Bitcoin at the peak of the bull run in 2017 when it was $20,000, obviously now you would say $20,000 is a bargain for Bitcoin, right? It's trading at $66,000. It went up to $125,000 last year. So you would say that $20,000, the peak of the 2017 bull market, was a good buying opportunity in hindsight, even though it was succeeded by quite a big crash. But look at where the NASDAQ is relative to that price level. If you had have bought the NASDAQ and Bitcoin at the exact same time, you would have, over the period of the 10 years that have followed since then, you would have experienced exactly the same gains on the NASDAQ as you would have in Bitcoin. So that to me is really interesting, because I think lots of people would say that over the last 10 years, Bitcoin has been an incredible asset to own. It's outperformed everything. But when you take these 2 points on the chart, you can see that this trend of Bitcoin outperforming everything is flattening out. Bitcoin is not behaving the way that it did when it was a really immature young asset and it just absolutely boomed when very few people were in. Lots of people have exposure to it now. The market is more mature and the price is reflecting that, because its performance is flattening out versus other assets. So again, I'll go back to this chart. I do believe that we are in the early stages of a major crash for Bitcoin, and I think there are some big risk factors in the market. I think about the MicroStrategy purchases of Bitcoin, the leverage in the system. I think about quite shady stablecoin projects that, in the past we've seen projects like Luna and others go to zero, bringing huge systemic risk to the market. I think about centralized exchanges that potentially could be insolvent, that lots of people use on a day-to-day basis. Now, I'm not saying that I've got proof that any of these things are really significant risk right now, but I just think there is enough shady stuff going on across the cryptocurrency space. We've seen some awful behaviors from some of the players that exist in this market. And I just have a sneaky feeling that what the chart is telling me is that we are topping out, we're going lower. And when I start to look at some of the other charts of the altcoins, they also point to some really, really significant downside. And it would not surprise me if we need a couple of those big systemic risks like MicroStrategy and the leverage buys that Saylor has been making over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. There is so much stuff that could be unwound that would push Bitcoin much, much lower than anyone can imagine. And the other chart, which if you've been following me for a little while, you probably roll your eyes and go, yes, you talk about this all the time. But here is the stablecoin dominance chart. So this is USDC dominance plus USDT dominance, the two big stablecoin projects in the space. And I just love how clear this chart is. And I've been bullish on stablecoin dominance from the end of 2025. And you can see back in October, I drew this squiggle. And not to brag, guys, but we are following that blue squiggle almost to a T at the moment. And the reason I'm struggling to see a world in which Bitcoin sort of bottoms here and starts to boom is because if you look at what stablecoin dominance is signaling, it is in a really, really big way signaling that people are flocking to stablecoins and people are taking a risk-off approach in cryptocurrency markets. Now, could it be the case that this is the end of the rally for stablecoin dominance and we come back down? It's possible, but I take great confidence in being bearish on Bitcoin, because when I look at the sort of formation that we have created on stablecoin dominance, what you've got is this 2 year long accumulation period, multiple tests of this range high. Eventually we've got a break, and it's only really been the last 2 to 3 months that we've started to hold above this range high here at about 8.8, 8.9%. And so for me, this rally in stablecoin dominance looks young. We've only just broken out of a 2-year accumulation range. We've only just broken out of a multi-year downtrend. I believe that this is going much, much higher. And if it does, you can see that these periods like 2021, late 2021 into mid 22, end of 22, you can see that these periods in which stablecoin dominance is going significantly higher often correlate with periods where Bitcoin and altcoins struggle with a correction and struggle to gain any sort of traction in the market. And I think this is pointing to a much, much bigger move for stablecoin dominance, which tells me that it's really, really early to be flipping bullish on Bitcoin. And like I say, you can agree with my downside targets. Personally, I think this is a really compelling setup, a really compelling formation. People talk a lot about institutional interest in Bitcoin. I ask myself, are some of those big institutions going to be interested in buying Bitcoin with the amount of systemic risk built up in the cryptocurrency market, the amount of shady, dodgy stuff that is dominating the cryptocurrency market and has been present for many, many years? Are we about to get a repeat of something like the 2022 bear market, which saw Luna and other projects go bust? Could everybody be caught offside? And could this be a much deeper correction than anybody really anticipates, particularly if at some point in the next year equities start to roll over and we see weakness in traditional markets? I think that will compound whatever downside we've experienced on Bitcoin leading up to that correction. And we will see, in my view, prices much, much lower than we're experiencing today. Now, can I guarantee that we will hit $3,000 a coin? Of course not. But we will keep our eyes on the market. And certainly at the moment, looking at stablecoin dominance, there's absolutely no reason at all for me to be bullish on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And if you take just a really quick look at some of the alts in the space, this is Solana. Now, before you judge my call that we're going to be heading back to $8, potentially, in my view, even $4.50, $5 down here, before you judge me, let's just invert the scale of this. Now, be honest, guys, if we were in a situation where this were the chart for Solana and we had broken this multi-year downtrend, which has been in place all the way since 2020, we'd broken out of this 18-month accumulation range that we experienced here, would you be saying that this is about to head lower? Or would you be really bullish and excited that we've got this big breakout and the upside potential is really significant for this coin? I think the vast majority of people would be excited and would be bullish on Solana. But because the chart is this way round and nobody wants to face facts that a break of a multi-year uptrend, the end of what looks like a big sort of 12, 18-month distribution period up here, the breakdown from the range lows that we saw here at about $115, $120, none of this is bullish. Now, I'm open-minded about a world in which we get a short-term bounce and we come back up and we maybe retest the underside of this range low here and get some sort of false reclaim. Potentially we could come back into the 120, 130 area if the rest of crypto saw a bit of a bounce. And maybe this takes much longer to play out than I originally anticipated. But I'm sorry, I can't see any reason to be bullish on Solana or Bitcoin at the moment. And when I look at the state of altcoins, when I look at the stablecoin dominance chart that we've just touched on, when I look at the NASDAQ breaking out of a 10-year, 9-year downtrend versus Bitcoin, all the signs point to, for me, much bigger gains to be made elsewhere in other assets, bigger opportunities in equities, potentially in precious metals, in oil, than you will find in cryptocurrency over the next couple of years. That's just my view. People hate me for it. I would say, this is GBTC, so this is the original sort of ETF in the space, the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust. Again, for me, I think I'm probably the only person in the world that is still charting this and still posting about it. But really clean price action. And you can see I called the exact top at the end of last year. We're following the blue squiggle perfectly. We've broken this uptrend here, which looks like a bit like a sort of rising wedge into this macro resistance. And I believe this whole formation here is one giant rising wedge, which eventually, when it breaks down, is going to send Bitcoin down to prices that most people cannot fathom. So again, just compounding my view that there is nothing to be bullish on crypto about at the moment. Now, what would change my mind if stablecoin dominance started to close back under this sort of 8.8, 8.7 level, then maybe I'd start to think perhaps there is legs in a Bitcoin rally. It's potentially the case that if that did happen, we'd just come back and retest this downtrend here before heading higher. Got to be honest with you, I don't even see that happening. I think if we do come lower, this range high is going to hold as support, and that will mean a lower high for Bitcoin, for Ethereum, for Solana before everything rolls over again. So I'm really not in a hurry to be thinking about taking any kind of position in cryptocurrency, particularly when this chart is so clearly pointing to outperformance in tech equities and the NASDAQ versus Bitcoin. And this trend line is so huge. It's 9 years old. I think when we consolidate above the downtrend break, that is a sign to me that this is a great entry point on equities relative to Bitcoin. So that is Bitcoin. What about equities? So I've talked quite a lot about the NASDAQ relative to Bitcoin. Look, the NASDAQ doesn't look great at the moment, guys. When we were back here, we've been ranging for about 6 months here. And I will be really honest with you, I've been calling for a blow off top on equities for some time. I have been really, really bullish on the NASDAQ. I thought this would be some sort of reaccumulation before we see more upside. But at the moment, there's no denying that price action has been pretty brutal recently. We are, I would caution people to remember that we are only about 10% off the highs that we put in last year. So, this is a meaningful correction. We're about 11.5% down on the 2025 highs. It's a meaningful correction, but it's not cataclysmic yet. And sentiment out there in the market is extremely bad right now. The fear and greed index has been an extreme fear for the last couple of weeks. I think the fear and greed index is at about 10 at the moment for stocks, which is shockingly low, particularly when this breakdown has only just started. And it would not surprise me if we see over the next couple of weeks, we see a reclaim of some of these lows before price starts heading higher. That's my base case for the NASDAQ. I still believe this is heading higher. One of the reasons I believe it's heading higher, if we pull up, there is a NASDAQ versus gold chart that I want to show you guys. So this is the NASDAQ versus gold, and you guys know that gold has been outperforming pretty much everything over the last sort of 6 months or so. There's a really interesting setup here. Everybody has been watching, not everybody, but some of the really good accounts like North Star and others have been watching the breakdown of this uptrend on the NASDAQ versus gold, but nobody has been posting about this potentially morphing into some sort of descending broadening wedge, which is one of my favorite patterns, which has a really good hit rate. And we broke down from that descending broadening wedge back at the beginning of March, but it looks like we've reclaimed it. And I still think something like the blue squiggle here is possible. Because if this really is the end of the everything bubble, if this is the end of the AI bubble, and stocks are heading much, much lower, as lots of people are predicting this weekend, then I've got to say, this is the worst bubble in history. Because if you look at the price of technology stocks, the NASDAQ, the sort of flagship index for the tech sector globally, if you look at the price of this relative to gold, we didn't even get back up to March 2000 highs, the end of the dot-com bubble. So we haven't even been able to tag the high that we put in 26 years ago relative to gold on the NASDAQ. And for me personally, I just don't believe that this is the end of the big bubble. I don't believe that we have seen the last of upside for the NASDAQ. I actually think that we're experiencing the early stages of a correction in gold that will probably last about the next sort of 12 to 18 months. And during that time, I think we will see some major tailwinds for equities. I predict that at some stage we will see the US backing away from the conflict in Iran. Some sort of peace deal will be reached, and that the fear that we're seeing in the equity markets right now will be turned on its head, and people will be rushing to get back in. During that period, I think tech stocks are going to absolutely boom. I think the AI saves the world narrative is going to pick up an even bigger head of steam than we've seen. And then I think we start to get some of the kind of euphoria that would make me feel as though this is the end of a bubble, the end of a major sort of, bull market that potentially ends in a really significant correction, which is why I've got us coming back up and sweeping these highs up here that date back to the dot-com bubble, but then pretty much almost immediately after collapsing and the market potentially going down sort of 80-90% the price of the NASDAQ versus gold over the coming years. So I still think the NASDAQ is really bullish. There's no denying that right now the price action doesn't look great, but it does feel like something's missing. And you guys might have heard me talking about this chart before. I've drawn a bit of a parallel between the price action that we saw in the NASDAQ back in the dot-com bubble, where price was compressing along this uptrend, repeatedly bouncing off it. It's a pattern I've seen quite a lot in markets, which is you get these repeated bounces off of a trend line until eventually the market just goes vertical. You get this kind of blow off top before a collapse. The trend line breaks and price goes much deeper. And I think when you look at NASDAQ price action over the last 15 years, dating back to the beginning of this uptrend in 2010, what we've got is compression along the uptrend. Obviously, it's not as steep, it's not as rapid a rise as we saw in the dot-com bubble, which was quite unique. But it's a similar pattern in that price is consistently bouncing off the uptrend, heading higher. What's missing for me is this bit here, where the market just goes vertical. And in the space of about 12-15 months, we saw the NASDAQ go up nearly 3x. I suspect it would be difficult for us to replicate those kind of gains today with the kind of market cap, the maturity, the size of the tech market. But I am still anticipating that we're going to get a major push to the upside that may see the NASDAQ double in price over the next 12-18 months. The question is, can we catch a bottom in the days and weeks ahead? Is price about to reverse out of this really unpretty setup that we find ourselves in at the moment? I know lots of people, including some people I really respect on X, are seeing this as a sort of broadening top. I actually think that this is potentially more like a continuation pattern, and that price is about to bounce back significantly in the weeks ahead. Reasons for me feeling like that: I don't think PEs are particularly elevated in the market. I've showed you that we've got nowhere near the high for the NASDAQ versus the price of gold, despite everybody calling this a massive bubble. I think it's too early to call a top on the market. I think everybody's bearish here. We're in extreme fear. And normally when emotions are in the toilet, normally when my feed is full of bearish charts, normally that means price is about to rebound and head higher. And one of the charts that gives me a bit of confidence in that view is this one here. So this is the Dow Jones, and what I love about this is just this repeated pattern of putting in a high, a correction, flipping that high into support, a retest, putting in a high, correction, flipping the high, retesting it as support, and we see the same pattern here. We bounce, retest the high, head much higher, and then eventually come back for a retest before price bounces. And where are we today? So we put this high in 2024, early 2025. Prices pushed higher after this big correction that we saw this time last year in sort of March, April 2025. And since then, prices boomed from $36,000 down here up to a high of about 50,000. And this to me looks like the kind of pullbacks we experienced here, here, and here, where we're simply retesting the previous high before we head much higher. And I could see a world in which we at the very least come back up and put in some sort of double top here at about 50k, but I suspect we might head much higher as the NASDAQ and the S&P do really well over the months ahead. So I'm still expecting a really, really strong 12 months ahead for equities. I think it will mark the top of this huge sort of bull market that we've been in since 2010, and when we get there, it's probably the sell sign for a much deeper, longer term correction on equities, in which case I expect silver and gold to do really, really well over the years ahead. So that's my view on equities. And just to wrap that up, here is Nvidia, which is obviously one of the most important equities in the world at the moment, the biggest company by market cap. It's really interesting because if you look at, I wanted to show you guys this this pattern here. So if you look at, obviously it's a different time frame and this took years to play out versus what I'm about to show you on Nvidia has taken months. But you can see this sort of broadening megaphone pattern where price made some lows here. Each time we took out the low, we bounced, and you get this broadening formation where the lows get deeper, the highs get higher, and eventually we flip the upper trend line into support. It's a bit messy though. So we flip it into support, but then there are a couple of times where we break back under and it looks like price is about to roll over before it heads higher. And obviously we can all see what happened in the 10 years since 2016. Price has gone from 15,000 up into the highs of 50,000 in recent months. And I just wanted to draw a parallel with what we're seeing on Nvidia right now. Lots of people are calling this a top, a broadening top. I actually think, although it's a bit messy, I don't love the fact that we've broken back into back under this trend line here. I actually think it reminds me so much of what we experienced with the Dow back here in 2016, and that this flip of the trend line was messy. There were a few times we broke back under before rallying, and I suspect this might be one of those. If we zoom in on the daily, I've been saying for a couple of weeks now that if we come down and sweep some of these lows at about the 170 region, I think that will be a great buying opportunity, and we've done that now. So all of these lows here have been taken out. Could we see one more small dip to take out this low here? Absolutely possible. But if we start to reclaim these and get back above 170, I think that will be a massive, massive risk on sign for markets. And in my view, this presents some really asymmetric upside right now. Everybody is bearish. The fear and greed index is screaming that. The put call ratio is elevated. Feels like the market is really well hedged. There's a lot of panic out there about the Iran war. If we start to reclaim these lows, get above 170, certainly if we come back up here and start to put in on a lower time frame, on a daily time frame, a higher high relative to the 180 that we managed to put in earlier this week, then I will definitely see that as a major sign that there is strength back in the market, that Nvidia is heading much higher. And hey, if Nvidia is heading higher, I reckon everything else does too. So still bullish on equities. Obviously slightly nervous that this chart doesn't look beautiful, and neither does the NASDAQ right now. But often the best buying opportunities come when the chart looks ugly and when everybody is bearish. And a reversal over the next week or so would not surprise me at all. And can I see in a couple of months' time from now us, coming up and breaching these highs at about $200? Absolutely, I could see that coming. Because if it doesn't, if the NASDAQ, a lot of people keep saying well, the NASDAQ could correct another 15-20%. Look, if we come back down to this trend line, which is held since 2010, if we get one more tap on this trend line, I don't think it holds. And if it breaks, we're heading for a much, much deeper correction. Given the fact that we're already in extreme fear, it feels like we're at the end of a correction rather than the beginning of a much deeper one. I might live to regret saying that, but I'm holding my nerve. I still do think that buying tech stocks, particularly small caps here, is a good move. And let me just give you one final chart on equities that might interest you guys. This is a monthly view on the IWM, which is the iShares Russell 2000 ETF. So essentially a mid-cap index that people can invest in. And you can see here we've got two really clear highs on the monthly. And we flipped this region at about 242 into support here as long as this holds. Now, were we to see a breakdown and we start getting weekly closes underneath, then I would say that's a warning sign that the market is potentially rolling over and we're going to see a lot more downside. But for now, you know, what is there to be bearish about? Like, honestly, if you step back, if you put the emotions to one side, you've got a high that you put in at the peak of the 2021 bull market. You've got another high that we put in late 2024. And to me, it looks like we've just flipped that into support. And this retest here should be a great buying opportunity. I believe that eventually we're going to see prices much higher, potentially as high as about 360. And I've posted previous charts that show how I'm using Fibonacci retracements to project this level into the future. But even if we don't get there, I suppose in the short term, this just cements my view that this is, at the moment at least, until further confirmation, this is a buying opportunity rather than a reason to panic and a reason to exit equity markets. So to recap, still incredibly bearish on Bitcoin. I think this is the start of a much bigger correction, but for the NASDAQ and the Dow and Nvidia, I do believe that this is the end of a short-term correction that sees all of these stocks head much higher. And I know people will say to me, well, the NASDAQ and Bitcoin are highly correlated. How are you predicting a Bitcoin crash, particularly of the kind of scale that I'm talking about, if you're predicting upside for the NASDAQ? But look, guys, there's been plenty of times, I keep reminding people, there's been plenty of times when Bitcoin has absolutely tanked and the stock market has just continued to roll on. You can see that here in 2017. Yeah, we had a bit of volatility, of course, in the NASDAQ during 2018. But broadly, you take the peak here and the low here a year later, in that time, the NASDAQ trended up. And you've got the same here, this correction that we experienced in 2019. All throughout that correction, the NASDAQ was trending up. And again, more recently in 2021, the first leg down before the market really rolled over. Of course, we did get a bounce in the second half of 2021, but this first leg down here, the BTC sort of crashing and then coming back up and swiping those highs, that entire time, the NASDAQ was just trending up. And again, you can see it here. You know, like the BTC put a high in 2024, and we only just about breached that high, you know, momentarily last year. But during this entire time, look at where the NASDAQ is. So the NASDAQ peaks out here in early 2025. We did see a correction, but it peaked out at $22,000. And we saw a high of $25,000 last year. Bitcoin has not been able to replicate similar size gains and hasn't been able to hold price. And that is possible. I look at this chart and it's possible that this is just the early signs of both assets rolling over. I know lots of people are calling Bitcoin a leading indicator for weakness that we might see in stocks. I'm not going to rule that out completely. You would be stupid to rule that out. It's possible that the NASDAQ and Bitcoin both roll over together. But for now, while I see IWM retesting these highs, I think small and mid-cap stocks look incredibly bullish. These look like great buying opportunities. While I see the NASDAQ reclaiming this key trend line, potentially the bottom of this descending broadening wedge versus gold. Again, just hard not to be bullish on equities at the moment. And then just lastly, just worth wrapping up very, very briefly with a quick look at silver and where I think metals are going. So look, over the long run, I'm really, really bullish on silver, on gold. I think, silver, gold, platinum, precious metals are going to outperform almost everything over the next 10 years. But in the short term, I think we have seen a top on silver. We've had this big parabolic run up. This really reminds me, it's the most clean sort of parabola blow off top that I've seen since the Bitcoin bull market of 2017. This big crescendo where the market basically just went vertical last year. As you can see, last year into early this year, you can see that from November to January, so in the space of 2 months, we literally saw about 150% increase in the price of silver, which is not something that happens regularly in the precious metals market. It was a really, really big move. Lots of shorts being squeezed out, lots of people flipping bullish on precious metals and expecting this to go much higher. I do think that at some point over the next decade, we see silver up at $300-400. But for now, I think this is a medium-term correction. Parabola has been broken. We're now starting to put in lower highs. And I think once these lower lows get confirmed, it would not surprise me if we come down and retest this sort of $35 to $40 region before metals put in a bottom. And once again, at some point in 27, 28, start to show dominance over the rest of the market. And I suspect that coincides with the real crash in equities, which I anticipate happens at some point over the next 12 to 18 months. But for now, still bullish, still long on equities. Lots of the charts that I've been sharing on X, things like Riot, Soluna Holdings, I think there are some great buying opportunities out there, and I'm taking advantage of them. Do with that what you will. Definitely do not take any of this as advice from me. It's not intended as advice. I'm just sharing my own thoughts. Hopefully helps as a bit of a counterbalance to a lot of the prevailing bearish narrative out there at the moment. Lots of people feeling doom and gloom about the markets. Personally, I think we will see some good times ahead in the not too distant future. I hope that's useful. If you're a crypto holder, I appreciate that this is a very depressing outlook on the crypto market, but I'm being as honest as I can be with you guys about how I see markets. Lots of people will post bullish content constantly because it's what drives engagement and likes and follows. I'm not the kind of person who will do that. I'll share my honest take. Sometimes I'll be wrong, sometimes I'll be right. Let's see what the market holds over the months ahead. If you've enjoyed this analysis, if any of it's been useful, then please do hit subscribe and help me to spread the message, spread some of the content that I've been sharing. Really appreciate you guys following me on X too. My handle is @PartTimeCharts, and I will see you guys again shortly.